welcome to Behind the Build. I am your host, Jonathan Jacobs. And today I have on the program a gentleman that is outside of Canada as we continue to do more and more outreach to this beautiful world of ours. I have a gentleman who started a practice that is now running in 3 separate cities and servicing, I would say, all throughout Europe and beyond. I have the founder of OB Architecture. I have Olly Bray with me. Olly described designing a home for his father, and one moment stood out. They needed a lift for accessibility, but instead of tucking it away, they made it a part of the design. It became a feature in the stair atrium. Thoughtful, intentional, and beautiful. That's the kind of thinking Berman Stairs understands. Stairs aren't just structural. They're spatial events. They shape how we move, how light flows, and how one space opens to the next. At Berman, every stair is built with that in mind, whether it's a bold sculptural moment, a refined architectural gesture, or an integrated curve that softens the flow through a space. They work closely with architects and builders, and we've experienced this at Walden Homes ourselves, to deliver stairs that feel effortless and exact. From wood to steel to floating assemblies, Berman brings experience, engineering, and design vision together. So your stairs don't just move people, they move the space itself. If you want to learn more or get connected to Berman Stairs, feel free to email me. It's Jonathan, Jonathan, @waldenhomes.ca. Olly, thank you for taking time out of your day to join on the podcast.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me. Absolute pleasure.
So Olly and I first connected in the fall of 2024, and we have subsequently found time to schedule this. I've been looking forward to it. If you're unfamiliar with Olly's work, I would recommend that you head over to the Behind the Build Instagram page. He'll be showcasing a number of projects on the page that you'll be able to see. And if you want to see beyond what he showcases on our Instagram page, by all means, go follow OB Architecture. The work that the offices are putting out is absolutely beautiful. Beyond the Instagram, I would also please ask that you give this podcast 5 stars wherever you're listening so that we can get some people engaging in it beyond the existing listener base. All of that said, I apologize for the long-winded intro, Olly.
That's okay.
Olly has offices in London, Winchester, and I want to say it correctly.
Go on, give it a go.
You've already referenced it 4 times in the pre-call. Chamonix?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Chamonix. Yeah.
Chamonix.
You
Okay.
said it. You said it in the French way as well, which is
I
great.
was in French immersion when I was a child.
I
never told you that.
No. Okay, fine. Well, we could do this in French then. Do you
Oh
want
my
to do
God, it would be brutal.
it in
I would get all my
French? Me too.
tenses incorrect, and no one in France would consider doing this afterwards. So Olly and I had a really, really nice chat the first time we spoke. We had a chat before we started the recording. Highly personable, running a great practice. Olly, if you wouldn't mind, as I have with many other people so far, can you give us a background into your path of founding OB, but then really, like, what did it look like for you as a child? Were you interested in sciences? Were you more of the art student? What did it look like for you as a kid? And where did you grow up?
Okay, so I guess starting with where did I start? Where did I grow up? So I grew up in the south of England, traveled around a little bit. We lived in Switzerland for a couple of years, which was really interesting, and that was sort of that's how we first sort of got involved with skiing. I got into skiing. My dad had a job which took him around to a few different places, which is great. But yeah, started off in the south of England growing up, and it was in terms of what got me started in architecture, what got me first interested in architecture. I wouldn't say it wasn't something that I sort of got interested in myself. I think it was my parents who got me interested in, or almost like pushed me in that direction, because my granddad was an architect.
Oh,
Yeah, he was an architect practicing in Germany, and he did lots of stuff. He did houses and lots of residential work, but he was actually most well known, or most of his work was actually furniture design, which is great. And he had this.
what's his name?
Oh, Peppy Thomas, you wouldn't have heard of me. He did actually patent a few items of furniture. One was this sort of big table, big drawing table, which was on this sort of piston, which raised up and down. And he just had this amazing office in his house in Munich, in Germany. And it was, I think, whenever we went round, I loved drawing, I loved art, and I'd always go in there and sit at his big desk and scribble things. And it was just an amazing room. It had this really evocative smell of like sort of, leather and I don't know, some of the sort of, chemicals they used to use at the time for, the printing process for the big, A1 drawings.
Dies. Yeah.
And it really just like lodged in my head. Anyway, I think I can't say I sat there and thought, yeah, you know what, I want to be like granddad, but I just loved being in his office, loved being in his office. And I think from then on, my parents were just like, well, he wants to be an architect, doesn't he? So from then on in, from like about the age of, I don't know, like, 3, 4, 5 or whatever, they were like, yeah, Ollie's going to be an architect. So I think it kind of just I kind of never thought about anything else. And so, when it came to leaving school and going to university, it was like, well, obviously, I'm going to go and study architecture. And then it sort of, all sort of started there.
Did you? I just remember when we were in high school, they had us always doing those tests about like what kind of person you were and what type of profession would be suitable to your personality and how you answered the test. Did you have those?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
did it check the box of going into architecture?
Course it did, but it was that sort of that bias, that sort of conscious bias that I had. All the questions I was going like, well, what would an architect do
I was
here?
gonna
What would
say,
someone
what
who's
did I?
involved in architecture tick for this question? And I think, of course, everything was just then sort of reinforced, and
Yeah,
it felt like it was just I funneled into the profession, and it was. I don't mind. It was great. It was like, in a sense, I didn't have, at the time, I thought I saw so many other people, so many other friends thinking, what am I going to do? I'm
right.
good at this, I'm good at that, but what do I do? And then they went into quite kind of did very general degrees, and they sort of came out and then they sort of floated around for a long time. And I thought, this is great. I've got like a very specific degree. I'm going into a very specific degree. So I've got a very specific profession. So,
Mhm.
I was very kind of controlled, and I felt in control.
Right.
Um, I think upon reflection, looking back, I think there's a lot to be said for keeping a very open mind when you're at that age, and thinking about what you like. But
Mhm.
just because you like drawing or you're into buildings, you don't necessarily want to go into architecture. Sometimes it's good to do a more sort of general degree. And I know a lot of guys who did different degrees before they came into architecture, and that was great. They had a real, or they did architecture and they went off and did something else. And they can give you a very good foundation for lots of other professions, which is great. And I think it's, in many ways, I look back and think, well, maybe I could or should have been something completely different. But, that said, I love doing what I do. I love the profession. I love being able to create the things that we create. It's amazing.
So where did you apply to school? Did you apply only to one school knowing this is the school I want to go to, or did you open it up and expand your opportunities?
Yeah, I applied to, I mean, I don't know how many schools of architecture there are in the UK, maybe sort of 30, 40, something like that.
Yep.
And I applied to schools all over the UK based on how good they were, or how good I thought they were. One was up in Edinburgh in Scotland, some in London, and ended up choosing Bath, which is sort of
Yep.
southwest England. The reason I chose it is because it was a really good school. still is a really good school, was quite hard to get into. So that was like that was one of my sort of, measurements of, how good it was going to be based on how competitive it was. And it
Do
was
you,
quite a small school as well.
do you remember what that was like? Like how many applicants they would have and how many they'd accept?
I don't know,
Okay,
but
fair.
I know I remember at the interview process, there was I mean, just on the one day I was there, there were loads of loads of applicants, absolutely loads. And I remember thinking, man, I know there's only a certain, number of spaces per year. How am I gonna get into here? This is gonna be a real challenge. But yeah, I got in, and that was great, because it was again, it was quite structured, the school and the learnings, and it was quite technical based school. They had we did joint courses with the structural engineers there, which is really interesting.
Yeah. I've heard of
Uh,
a few of schools that are like this and the foundation that it gives you as an
it
architect.
it's great. The unfortunate thing was at the time, I looked at it as being quite restrictive. I looked at it as being, why are we learning about, this sort of, this amount of sort of, technical structural analysis in our buildings. And I found it quite limiting at the time. I look back now and go, this is great, and I wish I'd paid more attention because, the time you just kind of you want to design, you want to let your juices flow, you don't want to be constrained by, structural requirements and gravity and things like that. But it's funny how when funny enough, when you get into practice, you have got to think about structure. And it's one of my big bugbears when it comes to, students who are coming out of university into practice. You don't expect them to be ready, but there's so many things that I think universities should be implementing to help students when they come out of practice. But I mean, in this case in particular with Bath, they had this sort of real sort of structural focus, and we sort of made buildings, we designed buildings which could be real, they could be put together. They weren't sort of fanciful ideas that could never be constructed. It was more about sort of, the idea of, materials and spaces, all sort of, coming together and being built, which was great. But I think, like I said, I found it slightly limiting at the time. And then it's only now that I reflect back and I think a lot of the work that we do now and again, versus what we started doing is driven a lot by the structure
Mhm.
because we're trying to create buildings which are more lean, more sustainable, that have, lower bodied energy, all of those things. And this idea that, you work from the first principles with a structural engineer to develop the concept ideas, I think is great. It's really empowering. And it shouldn't be seen as something which can limit the ambition of a project. As if you've got the right structural engineer, then anything is possible. So it's like I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but it's
No,
like,
no, no. But I mean, this is really one of the core principles of like design is who's involved in it and how is it going to get built?
yeah, you almost want to have like you want to have you've got it, and it's interesting listening to some of your other guys who've been on this podcast as well, and some of the girls have been, started off in construction and then moved into architecture. That's brilliant, and people, I know people who've started off in structural engineering and they've moved into architecture. I mean, of course, that goes through, history. You look at some of the Calatrava, some of the other famous architects out there at the moment, they're that sort of crossover, that blend between the two.
Yeah.
That's brilliant because, you can't design in isolation. I mean, it'd be interesting to see if you started off as a cost consultant or a QS, and then and then became an architect after that. I'd be interested to see what came, what kind of architecture was produced there. But
I was an in-house accountant. Uh,
ah,
I'm saying like that person. I was an in-house accountant at a really small manufacturing facility.
that's right.
And I decided that, thumb pegs were not what we wanted to be, not what I wanted to be doing accounting for anymore. So, I left and got my architecture degree.
Exactly. Yeah,
I haven't
that's
had
right.
that one yet.
I would love to see. I'd love to see what kind of architecture would be coming out from that. But it is, yeah, it's super interesting. So I mean, going back to, being at Bath, it was,
Yeah.
like I said, it was very technical. It was very structured. I felt it was limiting at the time, but I look back on it now and think actually that's really cool, because that really helped helped me understand about structure. I think as a practice, we've evolved a lot. We haven't sort of tried to, we did a lot of sort of post rationalizing of the structure. Once we'd get, the planning permission, we call over here, or the consents or the permits.
Yeah.
Now what we're doing is really working from first principles on the structure. And I guess what was interesting, going back to the bath thing, is after bath.
I was
When I was
clean.
at the bath, after bath, yeah, after bath, I came out nice and fresh, obviously. But we did like there was an exchange program in the middle. We went to the Erasmus exchange, and you could choose to go to one of the other universities across Europe to do like a year's study there. And I went to Delft in the Netherlands, and they've got a really big school of architecture there, TU Delft. It was a complete break from Bath. It was like it was just going from a school of, small school of, a couple of hundred to this huge, crazy sort of, energy filled kind of massive building of all these different ideas, going on, and all these kind of creatives all sort of like coming together. And it was at a time in Holland, and Holland is great. They have a real sort of sense of experimentation with what they do out there, with their architecture, their public architecture, their housing. But it's a controlled, it's sort of responsible experimentation.
Hmm.
It's not just people sort of, going crazy. But at the time, the university, there were all these other architects as well in Holland, in and around, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, like Rem Koolhaas, Meccano, MVRDV, all of those kind of guys. And they're coming up with these really kind of experimental ideas. It was great, both sort of formally, and sort of socially. Then it was really exciting, but it was really weird coming from Bath, where it's quite controlled, to this kind of what I thought was just this crazy environment.
Freedom.
And I kind of, was almost a little bit lost, and then went back to Bath again. And I sort of went, whoa, well, that's kind of knocked me for six a bit,
You felt like a sheltered kid, and all of a sudden they like you. They, I imagine it's almost like a pet inside of a cage, right? With a towel on top, and then all of
Yeah,
a
yeah.
sudden the towel comes
Whip
off,
it
and you
off.
realize that there's an entire world beyond that cage.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like if you live in the suburbs, and then you live in the countryside, and then you go to university or you move to the city. It was kind
Yeah,
of like that. And that's not to say that it was, the experience because the experience of Bath was great. It was just a very different experience. But then, going back there was, then, because it was like in between. And so sort of final year in Bath, and then it was all like, it's going back to that more kind of controlled environment. And that was great. And then
but before you go to the end, then I do want to ask a question about both institutions. Were the professors that you had at these institutions, were they actively pursuing, or did they have active careers in architecture and design? And like, were they running their own studios, or were they largely academics that had their degree? Because there's a difference.
absolutely. And that's a really good question. I've never thought of that in the context of Bath and Delft. But the Bath tutors were more professor
Yep.
like, if you see what I mean, in terms of, they weren't so much in industry.
Yep.
I mean, that said, they obviously, some of the tutors that came in, they were obviously in industry, but yeah, there was more of it felt a bit more yeah, controlled and academic. Delft, I think, was much more of a mix. And I thought that was interesting because you had a lot of the tutors and they worked for these quite experimental practices, these practices that, really did
They push boundaries.
explore,
Yeah.
as I say, these sort of, these new sort of housing typologies that they were doing in Amsterdam at the time. And it's great to go there. It's just a big sort of crazy experiment over there. But they'd come, on their day off to do their tutoring at university. And whilst they were doing these really kind of, interesting experimental projects in practice, they came to be even more experimental. They came to the university, to be able to let loose. I mean, that's what a lot of tutors do, to not be so constrained by costs and
Yeah.
and the other sort of matters. And so they really were. There was just this kind of yeah, like I say, this crazy energy that filled the place, which was amazing.
At either of these institutions, were I understand that you had the opportunity to be able to go from Bath to Delft, but did you have the opportunity also to work in the field as a part of a co-op? So did
In
you,
You mean in Holland?
or back home, did you have the opportunity from school to then go spend, call it 3 months, 4 months, or a semester, full year at a practice?
Yeah, yeah. So over in the UK, and I assume I don't know if it's the same in Canada, but yeah,
Yeah,
you sort of intersperse your training with with professional practice,
yeah.
and that was a kind of I missed out on the opportunity to work in Holland, which I really was one thing I really regret because I think that really would have because of the work that they were doing out there, I think that really would have excited me. I think I went back to the UK and then worked in practice there before going on to do masters, and it was I think I always found that practice it was exciting, but I also found it there were lots of things that I didn't like about it, and that leads on to one of the reasons for setting up the practice in the
Hmm.
first instance. And I didn't massively enjoy it, so we came back to Bath, finished there, and then
What
went
was
to
it? What was it that you didn't enjoy?
you know, I didn't enjoy. I found it quite. I just found it. I think it might have been more the fact that I was being, you were part of a practice that had, certain values, certain cultures that had, a certain type of output, in terms of, what they produce.
Hmm.
And, I didn't want to be necessarily, I could influence it to an extent, but I knew that it would take a long time for me to make a significant impact and have a significant influence on, the output and what they do, but not just what they do, but how they do it, how they do the work, how they communicate what they do to clients, how they talk about architecture. And I found it all quite, maybe that might have been a product of, the practices I worked for were quite established practices,
Hmm.
rather than the sort of the new breed, the young startups. And I think maybe had I gone to a young startup, young practice, I think I probably would have found that more engaging. I think because I work with the slightly more established practices, I was going like, this shouldn't be the way we're communicating our work to
Right.
clients. It felt quite I guess quite antiquated in a sense. And I didn't understand. I'd hear people talk about their work and I go, yeah, you're talking about that to another architect. The all the client's hearing is, white noise. They're not hearing. They want to be, we've got to communicate to them in a way that not that they understand, because that's somebody patronizing, but in just in a way that makes sense. Let's cut through all of the architectural waffle and the noise and let's sort of talk about how, what are we going to do for them? What is the how are we going to, how are we going to solve their problem? How are we going to make their lives better?
Hmm.
They're not interested in, the architectural proportions of, this thing, that you're producing. They want to know what it's going to be like. And I don't know, when I wake up in the morning and I have a cup of coffee and I sit and the sun's going to come and, and into this space here and it's going to be a beautiful place to rest and, and all these kind of things. And it's sort of I guess, changing the way we sort of communicate to our clients. And
Hmm.
I still, and it's a hard thing to do because I talk about a lot with the guys in the practice about making sure that we're able to communicate the value we bring to projects and communicate it in a way that makes sense.
When Ollie talks about designing a home, he doesn't start with materials or floor plans. He starts with the experience. What does it feel like to wake up in the morning, make a coffee, and sit where the sunlight hits just right? What does the day look like as it moves through that space? That kind of thinking extends outdoors too. At Kaplan's, they get that great design isn't just about high end appliances. It's about building around how people want to live, how they want to gather, relax, and take in the landscape. whether it's in your outdoor oasis of your backyard, on a balcony, or up at a cottage or vacation home. That's why their outdoor kitchen collection goes well beyond the basics. Whether you're planning something built in or modular, Kaplan's carries best in class brands like Wolf, DCS, Lynx, Alfresco, Kalamazoo, Urban Bonfire, Evo, and more. It's all curated to support the kind of living that starts with a coffee in the morning and ends with the dinner outside under the sky. If you want to learn more about Kaplan's and their outdoor appliances, feel free to email me. It's Jonathan, Jonathan, at waldenhomes.ca. It's
Super.
funny as you say all of this because all I'm thinking the entire time you're describing this is that if you had been at a younger, you can call it a more vibrant thinking or different, I guess maybe not, maybe that's not the right way to describe, but a less established practice, you might not have felt the itch. So it's probably a better thing that you were where you were because it helped probably align you with the values that you wanted to have as an output to go and ultimately start your own practice. So
I think you're exactly right, and I reflect upon that a lot, and I think it's actually great that I had those experiences because everything happens for a reason, and I guess even if I had started with a young startup, and there were lots of young startups there that I saw a lot of my guys I studied with, they started up practices of their own, and some of them have been very successful. Some others have sort of again just sort of got lost in their own kind of ideas and almost like talking to themselves or talking to other architects again rather than talking to the wider world,
yeah, the
and
Van Goghs.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. And maybe, once, they'll be more appreciated. Their sort of their designs, which never actually made it into construction, will be appreciated, after they've sadly passed. But, for now, I think it is great to do, designs and come up with great ideas, but we're about building things and we're
Yeah,
about putting
a
things
little
together.
little bit
So
of being pragmatic here.
yeah,
So so so
exactly.
so so then so tell me, so you were at this practice, this itch came along, and at what point did you establish that you needed to go scratch it? Like when were you, and I've spoken to so many people about this, like did you start off moonlighting with
Yeah.
like a small little project while you had the income from the what was known to working on the other stuff, from like, 6 o'clock until 11 o'clock at night? Is that what it looked like, or did you
Yeah,
just
yeah.
break away?
No, no, you got it. I mean, and it's so, the fact that you've, picked up and suggested that that was how it started, it's a good indication of how many people you've spoken to about this and how everyone, architects who set up on their own, they follow that journey. It was, I can't remember when it was, 2009, I think it was. My dad, he had multiple sclerosis, so he was like at the time he was sort of he was walking, he was doing okay, but he had like a walking stick, and he was, I mean, he was still young. He was only in his probably late 50s and something like that. But he lived with my mom in a four-story townhouse, really nice place. It was like on the sea, and they had like a little he used to sail lots, and they had a boat basically at the end of their garden, which was great. He loved it, and it was a bit sad when he got to the point where he had to sell it because his MS was taking over. But
Hmm.
it also got to the point where, he was thinking about the future. How are they going to live? They can't stay in this four-story townhouse. It's just not going to work. So they started looking for other houses, and they loved, my dad he loved the sea, he loved being by the water, but he couldn't find anywhere that suited what he wanted. So he said to me, okay, Ollie, what about it? Why don't you design me a house? And I said, okay, fine. And
Dad, am I getting paid?
yeah, well, it's exactly what it was. Yeah, yeah. I was like, what's the deal here? It's like, let's thrash out the details before we talk any further on this one in terms of what you're looking for on the brief and everything like that. They found and I was like, great. I was like, this is fantastic. Yeah, let's do it. I was working for a practice, but this is great. This is the opportunity to start scratching.
Yeah.
And so they found a great plot of land overlooking the sea in the south coast of England. And it was just beautiful. It was in this very sort of sensitive part of the UK. It was in a national park called the New Forest National Park, and they, it's very, very restrictive, very conservative. The planning policies are very restrictive. It's like one sort of big sort of conservation area over the whole
Okay.
park, and they love anything as long as it looks like a traditional thatch roof cottage.
Well, and I'm assuming there's when you talk about prohibitive nature of construction there, I'm assuming like they're very, very, very cautious of the impact on roots, trees.
Oh yeah, everything. Yeah, it is. It is. That's massive. I mean, it's a thankfully the site we had didn't have any trees like that. So it wasn't, it was in
Oh,
like a
that's
village, so it wasn't quite so there wasn't that sort of biodiversity or sort of, arboricultural limitations to the
okay.
site. It was more about, you're in a village, you're
Yeah,
in quite sort of a sense of place. Even though it's by the sea and there's a bit more sort of in the UK, there's a bit more, that's where you see the more sort of experimental buildings. I don't know why that is. There's probably some kind of, cultural reason behind it, but I don't know what it is. But anyway, so I said, yeah, okay, let's do something. And I thought, okay, let's put something together. And it was great because there's a chance. He sort of said, look, I'll give you a brief, who we are, take over, do your best or do your worst.
yeah,
And so then I came up with this idea for a house which was, probably slightly obnoxiously modern, within the context of, this very sort of traditional village. And it's quite a prominent location as well. Anyway, long story short, we managed to get it through planning. And that was great because, my dad then he was like, great, instead of compromising the vision, he was like, look, Ollie, this is a great opportunity to
sure.
for you to sort of put something together, put like a sort of a showpiece together.
Yeah,
And it was brilliant because it was about them. It was about creating something which was highly accessible. So,
yeah,
for them, a house which, he could, get around in, was future proof. He was just sort of getting to the point where he was in a wheelchair. So we put a lift in there, but it was about making sure that this lift and the whole house didn't feel like an institutional house. It was trying to create a highly accessible home that almost celebrated the accessibility rather than sort
yeah.
of tucking it away. So we had this, this really cool lift which was sort of exposed to the atrium, wasn't super expensive. We had to sort of build lots of things around it to sort of hide the sort of institutional elements of it, but it
Yeah.
was still, nicely exposed. And it
Well,
was
so
it was great.
this structure was very important here.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah.
Happened right back in the bath. I was gonna say, like, what a special start to your career, like an independent career, to be able to do something so meaningful. That
Yeah,
is like I've spoken to a lot of people, and a project like that, I think, is very rare as a start.
it
Wow.
is.
Yeah.
It is. I was so lucky, fortunate, honored, I don't know what the word is, to be able to do it because yeah, he was, to do something for your parents, to do something which would help him
Hmm.
with the accessibility,
Yeah.
and to do something that you would be able to do all of this kind of post-occupancy analysis on, because you'd be, they lived in it for, my dad got 8, 9, 10 good years out of it before he sadly passed away, and my mum, a further 6, 7 years before she passed away. And it was great, it was a great place for us all to go back to and enjoy. But it was like every time we went back, you as architects, you never get to really experience your houses, your product. You can do, and you go back and you have like, they have their housewarming parties, and then you go back every now and again, see how they're getting on, ask them for their feedback.
Yeah.
You never get a chance to really sit down, and
And immerse yourself in it. Yeah.
exactly, and that's great. And I always say that the best houses. So I came away with a lot of, just so much sort of, personal reflection and feedback from that project. But the best houses are the houses which, architects do for themselves because, they kind of they sort of they do them, they adapt them. They're almost like little test beds
Yeah,
of
of
ideas.
course.
You never get a chance. You never get a chance these days to properly stop, think, reflect. When someone comes in with a brief, when you get commissioned on a project, you've got to start working pretty quick. You've got to get, the ideas going pretty quick. You've got to understand, who the client is, what they want. They've got a time frame. You've got the
Yeah.
time frame. You got your fees. You can't sit there and and just reflect. Or, a couple of months on what you might do, or come up with 50 different maquettes of the project. You haven't got the time to do that. But when you're doing your own home, you as an architect, you can do that. You've got that time to sort of sit down, reflect, adapt, change things. And and it was a super useful project on so many levels. I mean, most importantly, it was like a springboard. It was you could, when I did say, yeah, I'm going to let's do this. Let's set up. Let's do it. I remember, the first day sitting down on my own, in my front room, going like, right, let's do this, and then going, right, well, what do I do? I've got, I'd had a few little things going on, but not much. I didn't really have a network. I was quite sort of in a junior position at the other practice. I was like sort of 30, early 30s, didn't really have much sort of to play off. A lot of people who they start with a big network. They move over with a couple of colleagues, or they start in partnership with
Yeah.
someone else. And
Yeah.
so the really the hard bit was actually going, what do I do, where do I start?
Where do I
And I
find my
think,
clients?
yeah, what exactly, where are my clients? I'm kind of like, where, so I had to go through this whole process of understanding what my marketing is. How do I go out and find them? Because sure, there are a few people who came along and said, oh yeah, Ollie's set up on his own now. Do you, I know someone who's got, a little bit of work, and that was good. But I sort of set about trying to work out what my sort of client profile was, my ideal client profile, and then putting together documents. I was doing some Google advertising, and Google advertising was great at the time because it was kind not in its infancy, but it's not what it is today, where it's
Yeah,
just
where they change the algorithm like every week.
yeah,
Oh, you
that's
gotta spend
right.
more money with us. Come spend more money
Yeah,
with us.
that's it. Yeah,
Oh no. Yeah.
yeah,
Back
that's
then it was
it.
different. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's everyone's everyone we still put money into it, but it's like it's a bit of a dark art. You don't know what's coming out of it. You don't know what is the value of you putting the money into it. Sure, you analyze the people, where your inquiries come from, but it took a long time to sort of understand where how you generate work, and it's ultimately, but at the time I just thought, right, what do I do? Okay, I just do a really as good a job as I can possibly do on every project, and let's
Yep.
hope that someone talks about me in a good way. But it was about, going back to what I was saying before, it was about trying to sort of demystify when I was talking to clients, just talk to them in a way that made sense,
Hmm.
so that when I'd go for a pitch, I would try and break things down into really sort of, in a really kind of simple way, because, I'd seen the way some of the other, the sort of the way things were communicated in the other practices I worked on. I thought this is so unnecessarily complex. It's almost like they were trying to sort of make the process complex to sort of justify the architect and the fee and all that kind of stuff. And I said, it's not necessary. And so I sort of tried to explain things in a very sort of simple, clear way. And did that impact the business? Did that bring him a work? I don't know. It's hard to say, but that was sort of a real sort of, focus for me, as
Do you,
well as just it was about not just the product, but the service and the way you provide that service was
so
so
do you
important.
remember, did you write down a business plan at this time? Like, or was it really loose? Well, what did it look like? Like, what were some of the core values you wanted to really make sure that you were going to bring to this business that was going to really differentiate you from what you had experienced and what you had seen and what you were seeing?
Yeah, good question. Did I have a business plan? No.
Yep.
No,
You are not
not,
alone.
not at all. No, I know. And I've heard the other people in your podcast talking about the lack of a business plan. And no, I didn't have one. And do I regret not having one? I don't think so, because I think there was so much that you need to think about, and so many obstacles, and so much heartache, and so much hard work. And if someone had outlined to me all of the different things that I'd had to go through before I started. I think it's the same with a lot of people. I don't think you go and do it, because you'd see everything you have to go through. I think the one of the reasons that people take the leap is that they don't see all of the challenges. Because if you see the challenges, you understand the challenges, you would get massively put off by it. So I almost say to people, if they're thinking about starting up on their own, I would never say to them, don't do it. But I'd certainly never say to them, because it'd be great, because it's such a great experience. It's so liberating to work for yourself. But I wouldn't go to them and say, don't do it because of all of these different kind of obstacles. And I wouldn't map out the obstacles and go, yeah, go and do it, because they'll probably go, thanks very much. You've gone and ruined my whole plan to set up practice on my own.
So okay, so let's talk about this next kind of phase of what this practice ends up looking like. So you finish your parents' home, and you had a few other projects. You talked about how you're sitting in your living room and you're kind of freaking out that you've got to go now find work. First of all, what year did you find the practice? What year did OB architecture officially register?
2011.
2011. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So 2011, you register the practice, and did you only register in the UK at the time?
Yeah. You mean in relation to the
Chamonix
French?
office, the Chamonix.
Right. Yeah, no, the Chamonix office was I mean, that's been a relatively recent
New. Okay.
incarnation.
Okay. So,
But
so let's
maybe
park
I've
that. We'll come
okay.
to there. Let's focus. I want to go on the evolution. So the other two offices, obviously, you're not starting with two. So what does it look like? Like, how are you going in 2011, trying to figure out what projects you're going to land? And really, actually, before I even get to the evolution of the offices and the staff and all that, had you established in your mind that you wanted to do residential architecture? Were you focused on I want to look at single family and multifamily architecture? Or were you kind of open to it all and let's just see where this thing goes?
I think that was the easiest door to open. That was the door that was open. I'd been working mainly on residential projects when I was working in practice, mainly one-off houses.
Hmm.
And so it just felt like the natural place to go. To be honest with you, I didn't think about anything else. And I think also when, obviously as all your most architects who start off on their own, will attest to, unless they sort of win a big competition and suddenly they're flying with a big art gallery somewhere,
Right. Good luck.
they generally, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's like I don't know that I've spoken to anyone that's had that story.
I know. I think it happened a little while ago. I hear all these sort of, mythical stories, about that happening. Like you hear about, Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano, getting the Pompidou Center in Paris, and it's just like, wow, they get this, amazing, multi-million pound project, but I don't think those that it's almost like, mythology now, you're right, it doesn't particularly happen because, there's too much risk now, the people who run these competitions, there's all these PQQs to go through, before you can even, submit something. So the last thing they're going to do is, say, there you go, there's a couple of guys, they may be amazing in the future, but we can't take the risk on that at the moment. Yeah, what was your question again?
So yeah,
I lost.
no, that's fine. So the question was about like had you established what typology you wanted to get into? Was it going to
Yeah.
be your main focus is what as it
Our main
stands?
focus, I would say we have there's two parts to the practice. There's the private residential
Yep.
side of things, where we work for clients who, have these sites in, all these kind of various locations. And we sort of develop, generally private one-off homes. Sometimes
Yeah.
we work on sort of big country houses where we do sort of, renovations and extensions to them. But, the bulk of the work is contemporary private homes.
Yep.
The other side is the more commercial work where we deal with multi-unit projects typically in more urban areas, particularly in and around London. A lot of our work is in and around there, and that can be anything from, these sort of really small, intricate, sites where you're sort of knitting maybe two or three units into, a bit of, a corner site, or, you're trying to sort of cleverly unlock, a backland site somewhere, in South London.
Yep.
And then right up to, bigger master plan areas where we're looking at sort of, 150 units, mixture of residential and commercial. But it's the other side then is at the moment is the French. So I'm skipping eras at the
Okay.
moment. If the other side is sort of the French stuff. But it's interesting because we started off just, of course, doing it was sort of small house extensions. It was, neat little contemporary extensions to, lovely old traditional Victorian or Georgian houses over here in the UK. And it was great. It was so exciting because, you get this chance to work in these, where I was in Winchester at the time there was, and where we've still got the main office. It's a really lovely sort of old historic market town, and there are these lots of lovely old brick and stone built buildings, and it was a time when everyone was, really just sort of opening out their spaces. I mean, in I don't know what it's like in Canada. I see, I understand, the sort of the open plan idea has just been around for so much longer than it has been in the UK. In the UK, there's so much sort of legacy heritage of buildings, that is very sort of cellular, very sort of, enclosed, and people at a time when all this housing stock out there, and people with lots of money, they just wanted to sort of open out these spaces, create this idea of modern living and not these sort of segregated, rooms, where, the family can come together. And it was great, and they had lovely gardens. Everyone in the UK generally has, quite big gardens. So we create these lovely sort of glazed extensions which would open out into the gardens. And that was great. It was such an exciting time. And quite quickly, you could create a nice portfolio of these, really
Right.
interesting schemes which contrasted these sort of contemporary glass extensions with the old houses, but still sort of tying them together as well. There's a lot about in the UK, there's a lot about sort of context and understanding, what is it that how do you make something modern work with something historic, and
Right.
how do you not just slap on a glass box, what is the kind of relationship between the two? And that was a really interesting part of it. But that then expanded into one-off houses, and we started doing larger projects. And I suppose it was probably about 4 or 5 years in, we started getting inquiries from developers. And that was when we then started expanding into multi-unit schemes. These schemes, as I said, in and around London in particular. And that was interesting because we thought, okay, fine, if we're going to do this, let's retain the quality, the integrity that we've applied to our
Right.
private projects.
Yeah.
Move that across, take those ideas and move it across. And of course, it's super hard because, like I said before, you've got the budget constraints mainly. You're trying to sort of, take
Maximize
that big.
maximize impact
Yeah, that's
and,
right. Yeah,
and be creative. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's exactly, and it's great though because we suddenly found that we had these ideas. We were able to take, we in the UK, I used to sit on an architect's panel, and the sort of the region, and a lot of the planning applications that would come in, we would then review them and give our feedback to the local authority,
Yeah.
and they would use that as a guide. Sometimes they would, sometimes they would listen to what we said. Sometimes, if they were happy with it anyway, they go, thanks very much. We're just going to prove this anyway. But it was really interesting because you saw all the stuff that came in. The quality, the general quality was just awful. It was just so bad. I remember having a conversation with one of the more experienced guys in the panel, and I just said, look, we've just reviewed like 4 or 5 schemes, and each one of them has been shocking. And he said, unfortunately, that's just the nature of how things are, the industry. Yeah, they just churn out all this stuff. So I said, well, it doesn't have to be that way. Let's try and create quality at a bigger scale. Why can we not, or at all different scales? And of course, people do that, but how do you do that with those sort of mid-scale developers, who don't necessarily have a lot
Understand.
of money to spend?
Yeah.
And
Or
so
understand the value of what you're trying to actually provide them.
exactly. And that was the thing. It was like it was trying to sort of say, you can't just go in and go, hey guys, should we do things a little bit differently here. But where we managed to win was on the sites where the planners, the local authority weren't letting anything average, if you like, go through. So we worked on these quite sort of challenging sites in quite sensitive areas, where, you had to sort of maximize the development value
Yeah.
for clients through really clever design and ideas. And that was kind of like our niche. And that was how we managed to sort of, break into that side of the industry.
I
And that's been great because since then it's, that stuff has really taken off.
When Ollie describes how a home should feel, this theme kind of runs again, is that it starts with experience. The way the sunlight moves across the space, that quiet moment in the morning with a coffee, the way a room opens to the garden and makes the outdoors part of daily life. At the doors, that kind of thinking drives everything they do. Because windows and doors aren't just openings, they frame light, movement, and connection. They help define how a space lives and breathes. From slim sliders to architectural window walls, the doors works with builders, architects, and homeowners to deliver systems that are performative as they are beautiful. They carry premium European manufacturers like Aluprof, Rayners, Alaplast, Schuko, and Aileron. Whether you're after energy performance, minimal sightlines, or full indoor-outdoor flow, they know how to deliver it without compromise. Because before the finishes and furniture, design begins with light, and the doors helps you shape that from the start. If you want to learn more, please feel free to reach out to me and I'll connect you with Martin or Marta. My email address is jonathan@waldenhomes.ca. So I have a question about this because I think that one of the greatest challenges in trying to break into a new segment is understanding how do you structure your fees and your deliverables for a segment that you're not currently in to be some level of competitive with the others that you're going up against. So how did you position yourself to know or to have information about where you should be at financially to be able to not lose money on projects like this? Because I'm assuming, based on the smile on your face right now, that the first few were probably not all that profitable.
No. No, I mean, yeah. I mean, you've asked a question which, I think, we ask ourselves, and I'm sure other practice owners ask themselves all the time. How do you understand? I mean, at its basic level, what is the market? What is the market rate? What is the market rate? And how do you communicate? If you're not going the market rate and you're going higher, how do you communicate that value? Or how do you try and, sell that value to a developer? Well, you can turn around and go, well, we're going to charge you. It's like, I mean, it's testing because you never know what exactly the market rate is. And you sort of, you push, you push until eventually you get pushback, and then you go like, okay, fine. I think we've hit the ceiling. We know
Yeah,
where we're
the
at now.
threshold with this person.
Yeah, that's right. But and it's based on so many different factors. We have all these different spreadsheets. We have past experience of how long did that project take.
Yeah.
What different levels of architect, assistant, associate, director was on it. And we fee it all up, and we see exactly, say, how much you spend on another project, what do you reckon it's going to take for this new project. What is the RAPA, Royal Institute of British Architects? They don't really use fee scales anymore, but what would they typically
Yes.
advise or historically advise you to charge? And then we put that all in together and then go, right, what would the client expect? And then completely throw that out the window and come up with something different. But it's about, if you're able to explain to them and communicate to them that you be able to give them value in terms, generally, again, it is most fundamental of value in terms of, what is the financial gain they'll get by using us versus someone else. Will we maximize the site? Will we get more units on the site? And
You also,
another way we do it to put our money where our mouth is, we have said historically to clients, we've got in there and done it as joint ventures with them, where we've said, look, we're confident we can do this for you. We'll backload our fee to take, an uplift, upon getting consent because the developers are obviously then they're like, well, brilliant, you're on board now.
Yeah, you're
This
you're
you know,
you're reducing the risk, and there's a level of ownership to the overall execution. So yeah, yeah, of course.
and they love that, and that really helped us to take off, in certain boroughs in London in particular, and we managed to produce a few schemes which are really interesting. And what was great is we had the support of the local authority. They produced these design guidance documents, and they put, a lot of our projects into these design guidance projects. And when developers came, the amount of times we had developers come to us and say, I've been working on this site, I can't get planning permission on it, and they would struggle with the local authorities, and the local authorities would say, talk to these guys. These guys will be able to help you. We know, we trust them. We've seen what they produce, so support to
Yeah.
them. So we had so many developers coming to us saying, oh, great, can you help us unlock this site for us? And we're like, yeah, absolutely.
Hmm. And so tell me now, if you can, about the evolution of staffing at the practice. This is, you talked about here about the evolution of these scales of project. So what did you need in your portfolio to suggest I'm at a stage now where I need to bring in, your first employee? Okay, like what did that look like? And then how many projects did you have on the boards that said, you know what, I need an operations manager?
Mm.
What did the evolution of the employment look like? Can you
It was
recall
so
this?
it was yeah, it wasn't too long ago, thankfully,
Okay.
but it was so organic. It was we just had a we basically just whenever we got more work in, we got to the point where I know it sounds obvious, that's what most practices would do, but because we didn't have a business plan. We grew very organically at the start. We've implemented, so many processes and structures and goes from and business plans as such, in the past few years, just because
Yeah.
you have to as you grow
Yeah.
as a practice. But at the time, and in many ways, it was great. It was just like a real kind of free flow of ideas, and everyone was just working on everyone else's project. It was brilliant. But we just get to the point where we got another commission, and we were like, right, we kind of need to get someone else in to help out with this project. So we probably grew up to, I mean, we started in my front room in Winchester, and we grew to maybe, I think, about five, and we were sort of working out my dining room, and it just became ridiculous. There was like a it was like a fridge. There was like a fridge in the I couldn't I had this really cool Smeg fridge, and I couldn't get it in the kitchen because the kitchen was too small, and I hadn't done any work on the house or extended the house, and so we had to move the fridge was in the dining room, which is right next to where someone's desk was, which was great for them because they could get a drink out, really easily. But it didn't look particularly professional, and we were up to about sort of five people then, and I said, this is crazy. We need to formalize it. We need to present ourselves better to clients. We're working on projects which are a certain scale now.
Yeah.
So I said, let's go and get an office. And getting the office was the best thing in the world because it allowed me to, at the end of the day, close the door. And there's an office as in a
Se-
separate office in
yeah.
town.
Separate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That
Work and
was
home.
yeah. I mean, you've got your space there, which is great. You're separate from the house. You can close the door off, and obviously you've got your office as well. But it's to have that separation was just brilliant. It was just because I would sit there. Didn't have a family at the time. I didn't have a partner. I'd just sit there, and as soon as the guys went away, as soon as the guys in the office left, I would just carry on working till midnight, stuff some food in my mouth and work till midnight. Wake up the next morning, start work, and I felt like I didn't have a life. It
Right.
was just work, work, work.
So were all five of those people that were sitting in that living room, had you hired them as employees or were they contract workers?
No, they were all employees. The very first one was Jimmy from Australia,
Okay.
and sadly his mum passed away. He was in Australia, and he knew one of the guy, another architect from Winchester, had been traveling, sort of years before or something, and had met Jimmy in Australia, and so they'd sort of kept in touch. And he'd said to me, "Hey, Jimmy's, thinking of, just getting out of Australia, because he's sort of, had a, just unbelievably tough
Yeah.
time, and I was like, And he said, he's going to come over here and he's going to work for you. He wants a job, but doesn't want to be paid, And well, I I haven't got enough work to support anyone, So, but I was like, and I, gosh, oh God, and he's like, no, 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 don't. I spoke to him. He said, no, 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 I just want to get out and I just want to get some experience. I said, but like, I can pay you a little bit, but I can't pay you the going rate. And he's like, it doesn't matter. So he came over and I remember the first day he came over and he was like, this is when I obviously had no one worked for me at the time. And, and he knocked on the door and my house and opened the door. And I think I might have been in my pajamas or something, because it was super early. And this guy sort of stood there, this sort of surfer looking guy with sort of long curly hair, dressed in like, this suit, and he goes, yeah, and he's going like, I'm looking, he goes, yeah, he goes, I'm looking for OB architecture, because and I was going like, ah, yeah, you've come to the right place. And he just looked at me as if to say, like, oh my God, I've come all the way over from Australia, and this
You
is
got
what
a piece of floss hanging from your teeth.
that's it. Yeah, 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 completely, completely. It was like hair all over the place. Anyway, but that's where it started, and that was great because Jimmy was such a ray of sunshine. He was just like he was very talented. He's now set up a practice on his own. There's
Okay.
like this was sort of 12 years ago, something like that. So it's a long time ago, and he's absolutely flying. But that was like the start, and interestingly, I had actually employed someone briefly before, and it just hadn't worked out. And I just thought to myself, this is it. I'm just forever going to be like a sole trader.
Yeah, yeah.
But he was great. And then yeah, like I say, he started, and then we were, as I say, the projects came in. We got a big commission for a new house, which I think is still on the website called Home Place. And that kind of really, really got us going. It was just a great project. It was a great client. Sadly, he passed away in a car crash before we actually started on the build. But then his wife then basically sort of dedicated the house to him and just said, I want to build it, in his memory. And and she really stuck to it. And yeah, it turned out to be a great one. And yeah, from that, then we just sort of slowly started growing with the private work. And I think it was really when the development work kicked off that we really that sort of took us a step
Amped
up.
up yeah. So you were running the Winchester office. What? How many years in was it until you opened that office?
Probably about four
Okay.
years in,
So
something
like
like that.
2014, 15, somewhere in there.
Yeah, somewhere around that. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. That was when we opened, sort of officially had the premises in Winchester.
And the reason I bring this up is, and if you're listening to this, you can appreciate this because you probably got your own practice, or you're in school, or you're in the field, or you're a trade, or whatever, wherever you are in this. Understanding the fact that you go from greeting your first employee in your pajamas to now assuming the liability and risk with your professional license to have five employees, to have the overhead of the five employees, to have to feed them and the associated risk of their families, to have the overhead of the office space. There now is a massive pressure that as an employee or as an intern, you don't understand. You are now responsible for all of this financial output, and you'd have no guarantee, as is with every business, but you have no guarantee that business is going to continue to walk through the door. You have to go find it. And I'm saying this because the concept of going from that small living room, a dining room with a fridge and an improper setup for hosting clientele, to the first office, to the second office, to ultimately a third office, is, there is a lot of pressure that goes into being that sole practice, the sole owner.
Yeah.
So tell me, so what is it? And I don't mean to like belabor that subject with you and to make you feel that pressure, because I think you're probably feeling that all the time in some way or another. But what does it look like then to go to the point where you now have these? What was the driving force first to open the second office and then ultimately the third office? Like, what was, yeah, what was it?
Yeah. The responsibility just increases so much with the more the practice grows. I know that's as an obvious thing to say, but when you start, you have there's a kind of a different there's a different kind of culture and different atmosphere in the office. You're more like a startup. Everyone is everyone's kind of, there with you. Not that they're not there with us now. I like to think that we've evolved and developed, some really good values and really good culture in the practice. But at the start, it's almost like everyone's just, right, let's try and make this work. It's a startup, there's risk. So everyone's kind of like everyone's on board with that. There's just, there's no hierarchy at all. You're all
Yeah,
just
everyone's a generalist. There's
yeah, exactly. And again, man, I've got another conversation about, generalism versus, specialism in practice, but I'll maybe come on to that if we've got time. But when you grow, the sense of responsibility grows. It's constantly working out, understanding what your outgoings are, versus, what your income is. And we manage to just do that without implementing many structures, financial structures in place or processes. But we found that when we started getting bigger, we weren't just like a team of, 20, 30 somethings. We were a team that, were employing, mothers and fathers, who had,
mortgages.
had no responsibilities. Yeah,
Yeah,
they
kids
couldn't,
programs. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. If the practice went under, with a bunch of guys who were in their, 20s or 30s, they didn't have, maybe didn't have mortgages, they were sort of living with their parents, they were much more flexible and
yeah,
adaptable, and
yeah,
could, like, just sort of, go off and get another job, pretty easily. But, when you're dealing with, people with kids and families, yeah, that sense of responsibility really grows. And that added a lot more pressure onto me and the practice as a whole. And we found we needed to be more financially prudent. We had to have, we had to put processes in place. We had to, grow as a practice. We had to become more profitable. And I think that was it was something that was, had we stayed as a small practice, I don't think we would have necessarily implemented those things and become, more profitable. And that's the key thing. There's no point in having an architect's practice and doing great work unless you're making some money out of
yeah,
it. Because
yeah,
you don't make the money, you haven't got the time to spend on, and growing and, but, doing good architecture. There is, a lot of people think it's just about making great architecture. It's not. The foundations of a good practice are, being financially very stable and very profitable. And that allows you to then, spend more time on the design and create better architecture. It's just a sort of snowball
yeah.
effect.
We are starting a newsletter. It's called Inside the Challenge. We want you to be a part of it, either as a consumer of the information or to record the information. The concept is simple. We're going to book a 10 to 20-minute time on Zoom, and you're going to record with me and share your challenge. If you don't want to record, well, how about you consume it? You can email me to either record with me or email me to register and sign up to receive the newsletter. People are going to be talking about the challenges of operations, of sales, of constructability, how personal elements are affecting their professional life. I've already recorded a whole bunch of them from people in the industry, the owners of architecture practices and design practices and consulting practices. We really look forward to getting this out to you. Feel free to connect Jonathan, Jonathan, at waldenhomes.ca. We look forward to getting this to you. So tell me at this stage, how many employees do you have? And I understand that there can be a range. You can sometimes, if you're scaling up, you can scale up, and if you're scaling down, but like what is kind of the grounds you found to be sustainable right now between the three offices?
Yeah. When we set up the London office, we took on Toby, he had just closed the practice that he set up 4 or 5 years prior in London. And he then moved across to OB, and we used a lot of the infrastructure from that he had to set up the London office. which we've been thinking about for a long time because we had this practice in Winchester, which was great, but we needed more of a footing in London. We needed to have the London address if we needed it if we were going to grow. If you're in the UK and you don't have you're not a London practice, everyone kind of has this impression of you as this, this kind of nice sort of, cottage industry practice, in the countryside and which is not the case, because there's brilliant practices all over the country, but to really become sort of more have more of a sort
Fixture.
of international, yeah, people don't generally tend to pick up the phone to you, for a big project unless you're sort of London registered. So that was it was a really sort of conscious move. It was based a lot on the work we were doing up in London. Winchester's only about an hour away from London, so it's not a million miles from there, but we thought that it was a great opportunity to because we had all these projects and all these like really cool locations, and we define what we do through our locations on a website. We separate our work rather than in terms of what it is, in terms of the typology, whether
Yes.
it's housing,
Yeah, I've noticed that too.
because we do we have so many different building typologies we work on, like car recycling centers, to one-off homes, to offices. There's all these different things we work on. And we were like, how do we sort of, define what it is that we are? Do we sort of separate our sort of private residential to our sort of commercial work? We're like, no, we don't want to do that because, we want to sort of this sort of sense of design quality underpins everything that we do. So we don't sort of want to say, here's one brand, which is our private stuff, and here's another brand, which is our development stuff.
Yeah.
The way we've split it up is instead in terms of our locations. And that's what we love doing as a practice is responding to all those different locations that we work in. It's brilliant. We work in like really great rural locations. We do lots of projects by the sea. We do loads of city projects, real urban projects. And then, of course, we've got the Chamonix office, which works on the mountains. So it's like we never come to a project with a sort of preconceived idea of what it's going to be like. We don't have like we don't have a house style which we come along to a new project with and try and sort of superimpose it. We because we work in all these different locations, all our projects are so kind of different. That's what we love about it. It's really sort of trying to understand, what does this project want to be? What is it about the client? What is it about the site? What is it telling us? What is it about the brief? And it really, from that you get a whole load of varied, rich projects, which we love.
So to respond to that, so I'm gonna go back to it because I'm curious because you referenced the London office and you've referenced the Chamonix office. So how many people would be working at independent offices?
So we've got so the Windsor office is that was where we started. So that's kind of, I guess, will sort of always be
Home base.
our home base. Yeah, exactly. I think the London office is starting to grow, and there's about ten in Winchester, and about four in London,
Okay.
and then there's me out here in Chamonix. But it's interesting because it's what we've realized is it's trying to as London grows, we don't want it to be like it's not a satellite office. We've got so many projects in London, and it's a great place
Hmm.
to bring clients to. And it's just like I said, it's so important to have, that London base. But it's about trying to make sure that it doesn't become like a sort of a satellite office. We want it to have its own kind of energy and its own sort of vibe. The hard thing is when you've got, a bigger hub down in Winchester, it's how do not make, London feel like it's sort of the smaller bit that's always sort of, longingly looking at, the all the energy and the activity that's going on
Right.
down in Winchester. And I think that will, as London grows, it will start to generate its own, energy. But I think at the moment it's, we're in that sort of that transition point.
And how are you managing three? I would say so. If you're solely running right now, Chamonix, how are you involved in the other two offices? What is your life looking like right now between? All three. That was a good sigh.
Yeah. Well, you
No
know
one
what? I
sees
felt
it. Okay, so we're doing this on Zoom. And as I ask that question, Ollie takes a deep breath and just does one of those like,
I think you know what, it's I guess it's just because there's always something to do. There's always something, you need to catch up on. When you're working on I'm working in the business, but also I'd say in the business for 10% of the time and on the business for 90% of the time. It's in the business is developing, concept ideas for projects, reviewing projects with the guys in the office as they evolve. But most of it is more sort of strategic level stuff. It's working out the direction. It's talking about the marketing, the networking, meeting new clients, the different kind of events we go to. I think understanding the importance of networking is huge now, and is really is we're really working on that a lot. But what's it like for
and,
me?
and I would say like as you're answering this, as you talk about you said it was the in
In the
practice
business, or on the business,
and
yeah.
on the business. Yeah, in the business, on the business. So when you're in the business, are you physically at the office, or do you find that a lot of your time in the business is looking and reviewing while you're in transit, or are like yeah, what does that even look like
Yeah.
for you?
Well, so I mean, I'm out here in Chamonix with my partner and our two daughters, and we moved here. It was about 4 years ago we moved here, and it was a lifestyle decision to do that. We knew we didn't want to be in the UK for the rest of our lives. We wanted to, be somewhere different. We both love skiing. Chamonix it's a town, but it's also a ski resort, but it's a real sort of, thriving town. So it's actually more busy in the summer than it is in the winter with mountain biking and things like that. So we moved out here about 4 years ago. And we also wanted our girls who were like just about to start school, or one was about to start school. We wanted them to have a different experience as well. Wanted them to learn a different language, just be around something different. And so yeah, so I'm now out here, full time with them, and then I go back every month or so for about 3 or 4 days. Go to London, go to Winchester, meet new clients, chat to the guys. But a lot of my time is spent on Zoom, on Slack,
Yeah.
talking to the guys in the office. And it was, I started off doing that, and the intention at the start wasn't to necessarily build the work out here in Chamonix. But as I realized, my life was becoming more, every day on a screen, that started to get me down. And I realized what I needed was to develop some more work out here in Chamonix, so I could go and see clients, I could go and chat to them, I could go to building sites, I could,
Mhm.
talk to suppliers, talk to structural engineers, and that's why we started developing the chalet business, the mountain business that we're now doing out here. And that's been great. But I mean, it this all wouldn't be possible, without the guys in the office are brilliant. The team is amazing. They're so kind of, like, I go back to it, the culture and the values, that we all share is so important. And it's taken this long for me to find that right team. As you build a practice,
Mhm.
the hardest thing is knowing what to look for
Yep.
in your team. You can look at the portfolio, you can look at their qualifications, you can look at their references, but it's so much more than that.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
how they work up here,
yeah,
and how are they going to integrate into the overall culture? Can they fill the niche role and come at it with the right attitude? And are they not going to be, it sounds so silly, but like they're not going to be cancerous, right? And crush what you've spent time building, because those mistakes happen, those hires happen.
all the time,
Yeah.
all the time. Yeah, it's. I wouldn't go as far as saying, there are toxic hires, but there are hires. You're quite right. They're just not right. And
Yeah.
and you feel that for whatever reason, but you learn to kind of pick those up early on. Maybe even at the interview process. And we always have like three, maybe even more interviews with the candidate, that we're interested in, because you've got to talk to them, you've got to get to know who they are, you've got to understand what motivates them, what drives them. You want guys with personality, with energy, with drive, but again, that are aligned with the rest of the office, because
Yeah.
if they're not, then it just doesn't work.
Have
Uh,
have you handed off sales in London or Winchester to someone else, or do you still look after the sales element?
no, so the biggest, I was going to expand on this, the conversation on the team is that there's two guys who I couldn't have done all of this without, I couldn't have grown without, and that's Toby and Grant, and they're, my two co-directors. And they have basically helped me help facilitate what I've done by moving, our move over to Chamonix. They've effectively enabled that, because without those two guys, the office it wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have been possible for me to manage what I'm doing over here, and manage the guys in the office as well.
So you've got your two guys there that are largely supportive and that have really helped shape this and make it work. I'm also curious to know from, your standpoint, how have you been able to now manage being the sole person in Chamonix? You've got your kids, you got your partner there. And so how do you now balance life as you try to now build out a practice in a new region while also trying to be an active partner and parent? And how does that coincide with the business? Because it's almost like you're going back to the beginning.
Exactly how I describe it. And everyone, people say to me, what's it like? What's it like now that you've sort of made a conscious decision to build and generate, work, and build a business and a practice
Yeah,
over in Chamonix. What's it like? And I say exactly that. It's like going back 10 years.
yeah,
But part of it is like, oh man, I'm going back 10 years. I'm getting involved in, the granular, the everyday stuff, which, when I think I've got such big, macro decisions to make, back in the UK, it's quite a hard transition. The other part of me is, this is great. I'm doing design again. I'm really like getting involved in design, and it's fantastic.
I
So
think
it's
you
kind
hear
of
the
like
smile
it.
in his voice, by the way, if you're listening.
Yeah. I sat there the other day, and it was like late at night, and I was doing some scribbles, and I was going, "Oh my God, I'm working late now." I said, "But this is great. I'm not working on some, piece of marketing or strategy, or writing a challenging email to a client. I'm doing some sketching. It's brilliant." And I was like, "Well, this is what I got into it in the first place for. I shouldn't really be working at, late at night anymore, but hey, yeah, I think that's never going to change." But so it's kind of sort of it's a mix of, challenging moments and really fun moments. But what's great is that what we've been able to do, and I've got, Maureen is, we've employed her. She's a French architect, and we employed her in the London office, because there's loads of regulatory matters. You can't submit applications in France unless you are registered with the French Order of Architects. So, we've employed Maureen in the London office, and that's been great. She's been,
Because she's registered in France.
yeah,
Have
yeah,
you registered your business in France as well?
we've registered as a micro entrepreneur, but at the moment it's going through the UK,
Process.
the process. Yeah, that's right.
So by
But
the time this airs, there's a very good chance you're already certified.
yeah, exactly. That's right. That's what we're hoping to do. We're gonna rubber stamp things out here, which is really important, for a whole, number of reasons. But yeah, the yes, so setting up and starting over here has been great. It's been a sort of mix of a challenge and, and super excitement. But what's been great about it is that we've been able to take all of that kind of experience, all of that framework that we built, with OB architecture, and basically put it into Obi Mountain. And so, that took so long. The Obi architect stuff took so long to develop, to evolve, so the processes, to understand how things work, to, everything from, things like invoicing and marketing and strategy and communications. We've now developed that structure and understanding, and we can
Right.
sort of like
Yes.
supercharge. In that sense, it's really exciting because, it does feel like we're starting again, but it feels like we're hopefully starting again, on a, much sort of steeper trajectory. And it's been about, again, going back to what I was talking about at the start about, communication and how you present and talk to clients. A lot of the understanding I've had over here is that, when I talk to potential clients, is they say, look, there's a lot of great French architects out here, but, they are the feedback I get from them is it's kind of like, they tell you what you're going to get. They tell the clients what you're going to get. This is what it is. There's not so much listening being done. And there is also, there's also a cultural divide that, you would expect anywhere. And so it's an exciting time because I think we've got that point of difference. We've got that understanding. And we've got
Yeah.
that there isn't that cultural divide there because a lot of the clients out here would be expat
I
clients.
was,
They
and
would.
that was the next question I was going to ask. Are the clientele that you have in that region, are they all French speaking or not?
No, they're generally not. It's a real it's probably something I didn't explain at the start.
That's okay.
Chamonix is it's a real international place.
Yeah, it's a melting pot. Yeah, yeah.
It's exactly, yes. It's brilliant. And in that sense, it's great. You get these people from all over the world who live here. It's quite a small town in itself. I think it's only about 10,000 people, but it flexes, in the busy months, which
Yes.
is everything from sort of December till April. Then it goes quiet, a little bit in May, but not really. And then, before you know it, the summer season's off, and it's busy again with mountain biking, these ultra trail marathons and things like that. And it
Oh,
it it
sounds
goes
amazing.
goes nuts again. You would love it. You'd absolutely love it
Oh,
here.
I would love. Yeah.
Yeah, and but yeah, it's and so a lot of our clients, a lot of the clients we're working with, we've got a great Dutch client at the moment, but we've got Irish client, we've got lots of English clients, of
Yeah.
course.
So,
Um,
do you speak French?
a little bit, not enough, not as much as I should do, but a
Okay.
little bit.
So we're not alone. I'm not alone in the fact that this would have been a terrible interview in French.
Yeah, I tried to sort of shame you slightly at the start, make myself look really, like
I
knowledgeable, but I hid that.
I know I bit my tongue. I waited. I waited until we got toward the end to pacify that.
That was cheap of me, wasn't
It's okay.
it?
And so I guess one of the last parts I want to bring forward here is really about now how you've talked about it, you've touched on it, the balance between being a business owner and supporting your personal life so that you can be the best business owner that you can be. So what do you do and how have you now started to allow the infiltration of balance into your career?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we had a little chat about this before, didn't we? And it's really interesting and I think things have changed for everyone since COVID, where, there is the world has changed, the work environment has changed, although it is sort of, I don't know what it's like in Canada, but in the UK, it's going back more to, people insisting more on sort of office, people turning up to the office and being in the office. And we very much encourage that amongst the team because, we want to create culture and a kind of sharing of ideas, and you only get that if you've got people in the office. If you've got people sort of walking past a desk or something, you get those incidental chats about projects, and that
Yeah.
really really enriches and improves a project. But yeah, going back to what you're saying, it's changed for everyone because of COVID, and it changed a lot for me and for us as a family since we moved to France because now I am I sometimes work from home. I sometimes go to, shared office spaces in town. I sometimes, go to sort of hotels. I try sort of, mix it up a little bit. But it means that there's more of a kind of a crossover with home life. And in a sense, that can be that can be challenging, because back in the UK, I go to the office, I go to the Winchester office or the London office, and then I would, get the train back from London, or I'd, walk back from the Winchester office, and I would, I would be back at, a pretty kind of, regular time. So there'd be sort of, quite a lot of sort of clarity. I think the importance with what I'm doing now is to just be sort of clear with boundaries, about, just because, you're working from home, you kind of not just set boundaries for, your partner. My partner works a lot as well, but, it's also boundaries for yourself. So you sort of say, I'm gonna, work this day and I'm gonna finish at this time. And I'm, not going to work that day, and I'm going to look after the kids. On Wednesdays in France, the kids don't have school. They just don't do school on Wednesdays in France.
It's a bad day for school.
But yeah, I don't. I haven't kind of figured out why it is. You know what? It's actually great though, because it means that I really look forward to Wednesdays, because I don't, it might only be a couple of hours during the day that I'll spend with them, but because, I'm still working, but it's great. We generally go off and do something. It's fantastic. I always look forward to Wednesday. It's almost like a midweek break. I make up the hours, later on in the evening, or I might work, at the weekends when they're, again late at night, when they're in bed. But it's I just think that, since my mum passed away in the summer, and she was the last of my dad passed away 8 years prior to that, and it's kind of really, it's just as it does for everyone who's, I imagine, who's, loses a close loved one. It just focuses your mind and just makes you reevaluate and understand, what is important. And spending time with, with my partner and the kids, for me, is the most important thing to me.
Yeah. Ollie, I have enjoyed this so much. It has been so much fun talking to you. I said it kind of in and around the recordings, but I'll say it now on the recording. I truly wish that we were closer together, because I really feel like be able to engage in a lot of these conversations on a more regular basis. So with with that said, I do look forward to continuing communication with you, because there's a whole bunch of stuff that we're going to be working on through Walden and Behind the Build, to kind of bring this whole thing together, so that these amazing conversations that I get to have with people don't just end. That there's actually, it's the start of the relationship for the general community. So I'm hoping that by the time this is already aired, that's rolling out. But I want to say to you, I appreciate your willingness to take a chance with someone that you have no prior knowledge of, other than the random email that you received one day in the fall of 2024. It has been a very enlightening. You are a force. I'm just going to say that, to have taken on what you've taken on, the risk, the changes to your offices, to reinvent yourself in a new country and keep it going, the evolution of you as a professional, but also as a partner and a dad. I mean, for you to be at a stage where your kids are still young enough that you get to now start to engage in that. I don't know that you need to hear all of this from me, but you said it, that the ability to reflect. And it's a joy to have spoken to you about all of this, and to literally to see it visually, how your professional career has just completely evolved and flourished. It's
That's really kind of you to say, and it's been an absolute joy to talk to you as well, and you talk about how would I, why would I respond to someone who's just calling up asking to appear in a podcast, but then I saw the work that you guys are doing, and listened to the podcast and thought, well, this sounds great. And it's great to be able to reflect on, what's kind of happened, and talk about it with you, because you don't get many opportunities to do that. People, it's been a great experience, and I think I'll take a lot of learnings from it myself as well. So thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Thank you.